Welcome, Monifa Bandele here. I Never Knew TV special edition straight from Grenada. What's going on?
How are you? I'm doing well.
Everything's cool. Glad to have you here. First question I have is, can you explain how the current potential future changes to the Department of Education could impact American children, the economy, and the country's overall intellectual culture?
Yeah, I would love to. The Department of Education really is under attack by the new presidential administration. And I think it's important historical context, which is that the modern day Department of Education largely came about because of Black activism. The first Department of Education was put in place post-Reconstruction by Black legislators who were saying basically all children should have access to education that is supported by the public. It's a public good, just like you want to build roads and you want to have shipping across rivers and making sure that there's ways that you have commerce, that educating young people fits inside of that public good, public need, federal infrastructure that's really important. Because, of course, up until then and even after then, it wasn't just Black children that didn't have access to education. Also, white students and, indigenous students who were not of the wealthy class, right? Whose families couldn't pay for an education. So this whole concept of public education, like many things that are decent about some of the things that are in government now, came about because of the intervention of Black activists and educators and leaders. So I think that's really important. And so what you see then decades later is that over the years, as you have an educated populace, you have a one that's more challenging to things like authoritarianism, more challenging to things that are undemocratic because they're what? Educated. And so this idea that education is just creating people to be laborers, right? To help produce things for capitalists, isn't the only story. It also helps to develop critical thinking, not always, because we know the way our education system is structured, it tries to limit that. But it is actually what those visionaries had in mind when they said, we want an educated public. We want Black kids to have education. We even want these white kids to have an education because perhaps that community will behave differently too, particularly those that were poor and working class white folks. So now, of course, as you have a regime that comes in that is moving towards authoritarianism, that doesn't want pushback from the public on the decisions that it makes and the moves that it makes, of course, one of the first things that's attacked in the first 100 days is the Department of Education. One, any kind of curriculum that talks about what they call critical race theory or diversity, equity, inclusion. A lot of folks hear these terms and they're just thinking, oh, well, I don't know what that is. Maybe it's not necessary. It's not like math or science or reading. But no, these are things like the Black history that we've made sure is in the curriculum and critical race theory, this idea that you're looking at things and you're examining it through this critical race lens is a part of critical thinking, right? It's a part of building better societies and communities. That's a threat to authoritarianism. So this move to gut the Department of Education from its funding, to limit what schools can teach in the states based on the funding they can get from the federal government. So therefore the feds can come in and say, well, you guys teach a course on Malcolm X, so you're not going to get your federal funds. We don't want that. Or you have a course where they talk about white privilege and white supremacy, and so you're not going to get your federal funding. Those are the types of things that are being set up in the current structure. So there's the limiting of funds based on what the curriculum is, or any kind of way that you're trying to make sure that your school reflects the community it's in, which they call DEI. All those things will limit your federal funds. But who will be hurt the most? Students with disabilities, students and, parents out there that are listening, a lot of kids on IEPs. Now, when we went to school, schools were divided, even in an all-Black school. If a child had learning differences, as we know of them now, they put them in special ed. But now students have an independent education plan. Those are under threat, and that allows a child to be in class with everybody else, all their peers, and they learn differently. Maybe they need their stuff sent to them in an audio way. Maybe they need more time on the test. Maybe they need to take their test in a room that's not distracting, and they'll do just as well. So these kind of IEP programs, 504 programs, it's called different things in different states, are under threat. So then again, pushing students who learn differently into like special ed programs or to isolated, segregated situations that we know students don't thrive.
One of the things I want to bring up in IEP, because I taught for years, and I noticed that like IEP has a bad rap because of certain school districts. So, for instance, what I witnessed personally, I've had classes where there were over, say, 18 kids with IEPs. Now, out of the 18, maybe 13 like really needed them, and they really needed an adult with them. So, I think one of the critiques IEP has is schools who aren't providing the services they're supposed to provide with the funding that they get.
Absolutely. There's not a lot of compliance, and things need to be improved. They actually need more resources, not less, especially as we see more students who are coming up who, I don't know, the first 3 years of their education, it was remote because of COVID. People have experienced a lot of loss because of the pandemic and all the other factors around the world. So the IEP program can be, underutilized and misused.
Compliance, they need better compliance and they need more adults. Pushins, I don't know what the proper term they call them, but more adults to help their children.
More adults to help the children, more staffing, but all of that is under threat when you are cutting the funds.
Things going to happen to tier one schools and their funding.
Well, we don't know yet what's going to happen ultimately, but we do know that this idea of state control, this idea that states can use public funds to fund even private Christian type schools is going to disrupt the whole thing in terms of a very unequal system. That's not to say that things weren't already bad, right? But it's almost like the argument with Medicaid. Anybody on Medicaid would tell you, ugh, it's terrible, but that don't mean you just take away health care altogether.
Last thing on the school, could you elaborate more in regards to the transference of funding, public funding for private schools?
Yeah, it's happening in a couple different ways. So the states are going to get a lot of leeway. And again, I'm saying what could happen under what is being done currently in the Department of Education to say, and this is happening in some states already, will fund religious schools through public funding, like just directly, just straight up
Religious schools.
Christian, religious, evangelical schools, Mormon schools, all under the umbrella of Christian schools. Perhaps some other schools could slide in there and say, hey, this was state law is, give us some too. We don't know, but we know that who's pushing it are these entities that have Christian schools already, and they want to be able to fund those through public dollars. The other way that it's happening is through vouchers, right? So people are able to say, well, my kid goes to private school and, I pay property taxes to public school. So I want to get a voucher to reimburse me for my private school. And so what that is then pulling money out of the state's public education dollars to give to parents to put their kids in private schools. Some people think this is good. They're like, oh, well, that means I can go to private school. Private school does not have to take any student at all the way your public school does. That you could have a voucher and that private school could say, we do not want Jamal, we do not want Rashid in our school. And yet public funds are going to that school.
What are some realistic steps communities can take to better support our children throughout their academic journeys?
Oh, that's a big one. So in my organization, the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, we have youth programs around the country. And we actually have a school in Atlanta called Quilombo Academy, which is a K through 8 school that is designed to educate Black students on who they are and to really wrap up all the skills that you need to learn K through 8 in a holistic Afrocentric framework, and the students thrive. My own daughter, because we live in New York, didn't go to Quilombo, but she knows those kids because she went to camp with them. And when she arrived on Howard's campus, who were there? Other Quilombo students. When you go to Clark, my other daughter went to Spelman, you run into students who are doing very well coming out of these schools. Go back to when I was in school and my husband, back in the 70s, there were independent African institutions all over the country. And the big one in Brooklyn was Uhuru Sasa Shule, which he attended, and I went to Wayuse Shule, which was in Crown Heights. And these models are very important because they kind of show us how we can design our own curriculum, We can build our own infrastructure to educate our own students. But the shortcoming is that you can't go to scale, right? And we have to be concerned about the welfare of all of the Black students, right, in our state or in our city or wherever we're doing our organizing. So it's okay if you can build a school that can take hundreds, maybe even thousands, but we still also have to do the advocacy in the public schools where our kids are as well to make sure we're constantly pushing those curriculums to match up with these Afrocentric schools as much as possible.
And you brought up a great point because when I notice when leaders of independent schools, their conversation focuses on their school and kind of disregards the masses.
Hey, most of us are not in independent schools. Most of us are not there. But what we're doing in those schools are important because when you model something, when you have an experiment, you got to test it out. And you got to say, okay, we put 300 students through this education system. They came out and this happened. Here's where we can fix it. And here's something we know this is tried and true. So when, let's say we govern an entire municipality, we say, this is the curriculum for the public school and we've tested it out. We've had it over here in this independent school.
There are many myths surrounding abortion, right? Can you speak about the actual demographics of women getting abortions and your perspective on why they are making that choice?
Absolutely. Most of the people who seek an abortion are already mothers, 60%.
Say that.
Most of the people who seek an abortion are already mothers. Most of the people, up to 60% of the people who seek abortions are already mothers. And they are making decisions about their families. They're making decisions about their health, and they're making decisions about the overall welfare of themselves and their families. And that's a really important decision to be able to make on your own. Your family size. How many children do you have? How many children can you really have? Whatever's happening between you and your doctor, it's actually can be unhealthy, right? Depending on the experiences that you've had in previous births. Sadly, how old you are can be a challenge. All of these things, different health situations that you have. If you've developed diabetes and you get pregnant, it could be very dangerous depending on your condition. And so these are important conversations that people need to have with their families and with their doctors, right? Because it's going to impact their entire lives. And so this idea that, well, actually, I don't know what the people who are anti-abortion think abortion is about, other than removing their power to control women's bodies. And I think it's very interesting. People should listen to the conversation right now about the birth rate in America and how they're like, we need more babies. These are the same people who've been fighting against abortion for the past 10 years. So you're thinking about population. Do you have enough people to pick oranges and tomatoes to work in your factories or even just whatever, work in fast food? Whatever they're thinking they need people for, that is now landing on women and is actually putting a lot of women's health at risk.
What about the approach to preventive measures?
You mean contraception?
Yeah, in regards to
Well, what's interesting is they fight in contraception too. you know? So we have to understand this is not about we want you to do something else. It really goes back to controlling women's bodies. Abortion rates have dropped steadily, actually, since the 80s and 90s. I mean, it's really on a sharp decline because of medicine. We've gotten more technology. There's wider access to things like Plan B. You have mifepristone, so you have these abortion pills. And so this idea of someone having to go in and have an abortion, that has decreased greatly. But what they're doing with these abortion bans is a slippery slope of controlling women's bodies. And so you actually have women that are showing up to emergency rooms who are miscarrying, or the baby is no longer alive and they're being forced to not have the needed procedure to keep them alive or to keep them healthy. So you have women becoming septic. We had 2 cases in Georgia, of course they were Black women, where these women passed away and they were in the emergency room. They should be getting care. But the doctors are saying, but technically what I have to do to save this person's life is give them an abortion, and I'm banned from doing that in this state.
why do you believe maternal mortality rates remain disproportionately high among Black women? And what can we do collectively to reduce these numbers?
The maternal mortality rate is high amongst Black women because of racism, because of white supremacy embedded in a medical apartheid system. I think it's really important to state that because people assume that Black women are unhealthy. You eat junk food, you don't take care of yourself, you live recklessly, all of the stereotypes around Black women based on misogyny, based on misogynoir, specifically the hate that we face as Black women in this country feeds into why the heart of this matter is not addressed. But Black women researchers and doctors put out a report several years ago that said even when you control for things like poverty, education, pre-existing conditions, when you control in the data for all of that, it's still 2 to 3 times more likely for Black women to die during childbirth than white women in the United States. So you have white women who are in poor areas who have a high school education or less, and you have Black women who have access to many resources, highly educated, whatever that means. I'm just repeating the data. And they are facing challenges like we saw with the Serena Williams, who almost died giving childbirth, and so many other cases where Black women are ignored. We're thought that our pain tolerance is higher. So when Black women, this has happened to me, are in the hospital and have said they're in pain, you're literally ignored. It's almost like, how can you be in pain, right?
So what was your personal experience?
My personal experience, I ended up having 2 C-sections with both of my daughters. And my life wasn't at risk, but they went into fetal distress. And so we had to have C-sections for each one of them. But yeah, going into the hospital, which is why Black people don't like going into the hospital, um, you feel it. And when you're pregnant, you're very vulnerable. You can maybe advocate for yourself, maybe you can't. Labor is extremely painful. You're going back and forth. And so what people will tell you is that's just normal. That's just, you're being hysterical, which is a lot of Black women are told they're being hysterical because whenever we advocate for something, it's perceived as like abrasive or aggressive. Black men experience this too, right? When you ask for something, you're someone, why are you being so aggressive? So with Black women, we're in the hospital and that Blackness, right, translates as aggression and people try to move away. And so I did not have a near-death experience, but it wasn't a good one because all through the process until my own doctor arrived, I was basically ignored. I think that they don't want to bother with uh, Black women, women in general. And also, the United States is a medicalized pregnancy. Pregnancy is medicalized in the United States. And in my opinion, it is really because of the dollars and cents that are involved, right? You're going to pay more for that C-section than you're going to for a natural birth or a vaginal birth, I should say.
And what's wild is that when that's the dynamic between the doctor and patient in that type of situation where a life is being born, it's pretty disturbing because what nurturing care can you have when you're doing something purposely? You're doing an action that gives you more profits, but it's not beneficial to the patient or the child.
And I have another example that's even more diabolical. We were having a task force meeting about C-sections in New York City. There was one hospital in Brooklyn, Kings County. They were trying to figure out why they have a C-section rate of like 50%. Like you go in the hospital and at that particular moment, because it's like 51%, you were more likely to have a C-section than a vaginal birth. And one of the nurses spoke up and said that when they send students through the hospital who need surgical hours, right? And so if it's a question, they'll have the C-section because they have the students there who need the surgical hours. And so this was a combination of folks from Kings County and downstate. And this was very alarming, it wasn't addressed, but we're very vulnerable when we're pregnant. And whatever the medical staff is telling you, you gonna listen because you like, I'm at your mercy. You telling me I need surgery. I'm here pregnant, so I'm leaning towards that. But yeah, and then there's an actual study that was done that said that C-sections were more likely to happen Friday towards the end of the day. People trying to go home. You still laboring. Oh, you need a C-section.
What are your thoughts on the role hip hop has played in shaping attitudes towards relationships and behavior in 2025?
This is an interesting question, and I'm not like a hip hopologist, but I have worked with hip hop artists and in hip hop culture around my work around freeing political prisoners and raising awareness about mass incarceration in the prison industrial complex in the United States. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, the Malcolm X grassroots movement launched the Black August Hip Hop Project, where we worked with groups like Dead Prez, Mos Def, Talib Kweli, Common, Erica Badu, The Roots, many, many, many amazing artists to bring awareness about incarcerated political prisoners, freedom fighters from organizations like the Black Panther Party, the Republic of New Africa, MOVE, and a lot of organizations during the 60s and 70s where the state, in order to squash those organizations through COINTELPRO, either assassinated leaders or criminalized other leaders in those organizations. And so as a young person, as a kid, in the 90s, we're finding out, wow, these mamas and babas are still incarcerated. Some of them live in exile because they were revolutionaries when they were younger. And so we found that we needed to use our culture to raise awareness and to really challenge people's perceptions about their incarceration, but also around the mass incarceration that was ballooning in the 90s, right? So when we started this in 99, this is like 5 years after the 1994 crime bill. So we're also starting to see our peers go away getting 25 years. Yeah, for real. Young people, we're not going to see you again until you're 50 years old, kind of thing. So hip hop can be a tool for many, many things, but that's what culture is. It's a tool, and it's a tool that can be used for you. It's a tool that can be used against you. And it's my opinion is that if you're not intentional about your culture or anything that you have at your disposal, that's a tool, or how some people say culture is a weapon. So you think about a weapon, right? You can use it to defend yourself, or it can be turned against you. And that's what we see a lot of with hip hop. We see that the corporate takeover of the culture has allowed it to be a marketing tool for, everything that capitalism has to offer poor people, and also to kind of fuel the fire. I'm not saying that hip hop created the misogyny that we're experiencing in this country. That is clearly manufactured by those who designed this country and brought us in as enslaved people. But it had a way of giving energy to those types of sentiments, not just about women, but particularly about Black women. And so I think it really is on us, right, to take our culture back. I believe we can do it, but I'm just like an optimist. That's why I'm an activist. That's why I do this work, because I'm always like, we can do this, we can win. But it feels like it's a long way out sometimes.
I think what the argument with hip hop is that the consumer needs to take more responsibility and accountability on what they consume,
Hmm.
because there are abundance of artists, as you would know, in any genre that have music that sounds very good, but it's conscious. People just depend on what the system gives you
Yeah,
and critique that as if that's the only music. There are only 20 people or 20 songs on the top 10. I
that's
mean,
right.
top 20. And out of the top 20, there are probably only about 15 artists or 13 artists because people have numerous songs. And you act as if there's nothing else out there.
Yeah.
And
And the
you're
radio
right.
has those on heavy rotation. You may need to take a little more effort
That's
to
why I think
find the other
collectively that's
pieces.
needed, because my concern is that people who are making good music, especially the younger generation who aspire to do so, they're discouraged because they see those before them struggling and they don't feel that they can do it and survive doing it. So
They,
people with talent who are coming in, they may not be there as much as they were in the past.
it's so true. We just had a big event in Brooklyn. It was the 25th anniversary of Let's Get Free, which is Dead Prez's freshman album. It launched so much for us, but they were banned from clubs when we had to book Black August, and they were our headliners. We didn't put them on the flyer, and we couldn't tell one of the venues they were performing because they were like, "You can't have Dead Prez." They said we kind of never were going to make a lot of money. We were never going to get rich off of this, but we were embedded in a political movement and we saw our talent as being a vehicle for that political movement. And not all artists have that orientation. And so to this day, they rocking with us, But I'm sure it's not easy because what you see in hip hop and what you see with art, athleticism, action, whatever your talent is, prosperity is measured, in wealth. And I'm not saying that people should not make a living off of what they do, because I believe in supporting artists. I'm going to pay you as an artist. But what this capitalist system has done is it's distorted that. And I'm not really sure how we get back, other than, like you said, as consumers, got to support the dead prizes out there.
Consumers, and also, I remember my brother told me this. He was saying how in a capitalistic society, genius is rated by how much money you can earn for the system. And we need to do away with that thought process. We need to understand that thought process and do away with it and see true genius and support it, especially genius that's beneficial to the culture.
Absolutely. And I do believe that some of our mainstream artists are doing things that are subversive, and I appreciate that. I never really kind of expect people to make the same sacrifices that I do or that I would, because I think it puts us, it distances us from our people, right? People have a background where they've aspired to be able to do things for their family members and their community. So I do appreciate when mainstream artists do things that are more subversive. So in addition to us as consumers needing to support the artists who are like maybe underground and not as mainstream, when artists do step out there and do a Colin Kaepernick with their art, because I think that athletes are artists too, um, we gotta have their back. They can't be like, oh, I stepped my foot out there and the community was like, ain't nobody tell you to get controversial.
From what I understand, you had experience of meeting Asada Shakur in Cuba, right? Were you able to have a conversation? What was the whole interaction like?
Absolutely, yes. I was able to meet with and talk and to be in community with two sisters. One well known, Mama Asada Shakur, who was our amazing freedom fighter, and also Mama Nahanda Abiodun, who was also a political exile. She recently passed away, but she was someone who was indicted for liberating Asada Shakur from prison. So the comrades that are Nahandas were in prison, but she actually also escaped and was in Cuba, as well as Asada, who was someone who was freed from prison. And so we were just blessed, I want to say it was 1998, to go to the World Youth Festival in Cuba, in Havana, Cuba, with hundreds of young people from the United States, but tens of thousands from around the world. And our delegation within the U.S. delegation, which was the Malcolm X grassroots movement, we got our own, meetings with elders there and people who had supported Black liberation movements in the past. And Asada and Nahanda, who we were like celebrating, cheering, giving them a standing ovation, they said, we love this and we appreciate this, but our comrades are still locked up. They're still imprisoned for freeing us, or for Nahanda making sure she didn't get incarcerated alongside of them. And if you really want to celebrate us and to love us, work to free our political prisoners. And for many of us, we had already been doing some political prisoner work. We remembered Geronimo Pratt had gotten out of prison maybe just a few years before that, for like really young people when Nelson Mandela got out, I think in like 91. So we were like already excited about that. But that charge from those, elders, freedom fighters, it put a different fire in the belly, right? And that's when the Black August Hip Hop Project was conceived of. The two people who led it was my husband, Monifa Bandele, and Baye Adolfo from our group. And we all then, it became like a central thing that we did every year during Black August. So Black August was a tradition that came out of the California prison system to celebrate people like George Jackson and Qatari, to memorialize them. Every August, the prisoners would fast, they would study, would work out, there'd be no fights, they didn't engage in anything antisocial. It was a month of discipline to honor their fallen freedom fighters. And so we were like, this is perfect. Take this and do something that's cultural, because we know what our folks want to hear, and embed in that the principles of Black August from out of the prison system, teach them about Attica, because New York and the Attica Rebellion is linked also to Black August. People don't know. It was like right after. And then also talk about those political prisons that are still in. And it was widely successful. We also we went back to Cuba several times with our Black August delegation. And one time we took Common with us. And then when he got back, he wrote Song for Asada. So while some young people had read her biography, we know a lot of people didn't read no biography. That put her story on a whole nother level to where people were like, oh yeah, I know that's a Common song. That's that lady that's in, some people say, oh, it's Tupac's godmother, true kinda. And she has this whole story, because that Shakur family is a cadre in the movement. Um, it really popularized her and allowed us to fight to free those political prisoners that were connected to her case, like Mutulu Shakur, like Sekou Odinga, like Sundiata Acoli, who was arrested at the same time as her, is now home with his family.
I'm not sure if you had this conversation with her, but I always wonder people who really like sacrifice and fought, how do they view current day Black people?
Yeah, I think it's hard because they were away for so long, and they were away during a time when the vibes were just different. So when Herman Bell and Jalil Muntaqim recently got out, now maybe 5 years ago and 6 years ago respectively, they smartphones. They had been in prison. This was before the Asada, the incident on the New Jersey Turnpike in '73. They were like young men, and now they came out and they're like, learning this thing. But a couple of things were powerful to them, including Sekou Odinga, who got out right around the time of the Ferguson uprising, is that they had a lot of hope in young people. Interestingly enough, they're not like a lot of other elders where they're like, down in us, y'all ain't doing nothing, da 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 da. They actually say, we didn't know what we were doing either. We were building the plane while flying it, and we made some mistakes. And, a lot of them tell us things like, you can get ahead of the people. Can't do that. Because then you look back, they're like, we don't know what you're doing over there. That wasn't for us. So they talk about these mistakes and they share these lessons and they want to still be in it, as these mentors. And they have critiques, that like the Colin Kaepernick. They're like, why that brother didn't get more support and things like that. But they realize it's a different time, so they just offer lessons from their time. And they tell us, they said, but y'all working in a whole different landscape.
Yeah, and I think speaking to numerous elders, especially some who get disillusioned,
Yeah,
they don't understand their work wasn't for their time. I think we struggle with that. Like we want to see results in our time. That's not necessarily the case.
it's not the case.
And I think we struggle. I think because of a capitalistic society, like you're supposed to be rewarded right now.
Hmm.
And I think that's what discourages people most in regards to the time frame of seeing results.
That instant gratification. You can have delayed gratification, and they've done those studies with kids with the donut thing, right? You can have more success in your work because you're not thinking this is a short game. You're thinking this is a long game. And that's why you got to do the experiments. You got to do the schools. You have to experiment with alternative forms of economies, like building co-ops in your community, to say that I'm actually planting a seed so that when my children or my grandchildren, they can go and say, we could scale up co-ops. Look at these co-ops, this cooperative ecosystem they did back
Have
in the
more,
2020s.
they'll have more skills than us. They'll have more
Yeah,
resources than us, and they'll have more vision than us. Yeah.
absolutely. But like you said, people want their flowers now. And you don't break down a system that's thousands and thousands of years embedded, like the patriarchy, like the white supremacy, like the capitalism that began to fuel that slave trade overnight or in one person's lifespan.